If you liked this story, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, in order to strengthen our community, I would like to know where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video. The air was thick with anticipation that late afternoon as the sun dipped behind the clouds, casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Charles Richardson, a decorated war veteran who had served his country with honor, stood on the porch of his modest home. At 72 years old, his body had weathered the years of combat and hardship, but his mind was still sharp, and his spirit unyielding. His wife, Evelyn, who had been his constant companion for over 5 decades, sat next to him in her favorite rocking chair, her wrinkled hands folded neatly in her lap. The sound of children playing down the street and the hum of lawnmowers filled the air, but something felt off to Charles. "I think the world's changing too fast for us old folks," Charles remarked, his gravelly voice carrying a tone of nostalgia. Evelyn nodded but said nothing. She had heard these words before. They both had lived through the civil rights movement, through marches and protests. They had seen the best and worst of humanity, but the fight had taken its toll. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the sound of a loud, screeching car. A police cruiser sped down the street, the tires screeching as it came to an abrupt stop a few houses down. The 2 officers inside didn't seem to be in any particular hurry, but their arrival raised a few eyebrows among the neighbors. It wasn't often that police patrols made their rounds in this part of town. Charles squinted in their direction. "Something's not right," he muttered under his breath. Evelyn glanced at him, her face betraying concern. Her intuition told her the same. The officer who stepped out first was a tall, burly man with close-cropped blonde hair and an expression that screamed superiority. His uniform was spotless, but there was an unsettling coldness in his eyes. His partner, a younger officer with dark hair, looked more uncertain, almost as if he didn't fully agree with their mission. "What do you think they want?" Evelyn asked quietly. Charles shrugged, but his eyes remained locked on the scene unfolding. The 2 officers walked toward a group of young black men who were sitting on the curb, talking. Their laughter died down as soon as they spotted the officers approaching. The tension in the air was palpable. "I don't like this," Charles said, standing up from his chair. "I'm gonna go see what's going on." Evelyn grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Charles, no. Please, don't. It's none of our business." But Charles was already moving, the fire of his younger years igniting inside him. He had seen too many injustices in his lifetime, and if there was even the slightest chance of something wrong happening, he couldn't stand by and do nothing. As he approached the scene, the blonde officer's voice could be heard loud and clear. "What are you boys doing here? Got nothing better to do than loiter?" One of the young men stood up, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "We're just talking, officer. We live here." The officer sneered. "You live here? Doesn't look like you belong." Charles clenched his fists as he drew closer. "That's enough." His voice was firm but respectful. The officer turned his gaze to Charles, his eyes narrowing. "And who the hell are you?" "I'm a neighbor," Charles replied, standing his ground. "These boys haven't done anything wrong. They're just talking. Why don't you leave them alone?" The officer took a step closer to Charles, his presence menacing. "Why don't you mind your own damn business, old man?" Charles's heart raced, but he didn't back down. "This is my business. This is my neighborhood, and I'm not going to let you harass these kids." The officer's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, his younger partner intervened. "Maybe we should just go. There's nothing going on here." But the blonde officer wasn't having it. "Shut up, rookie. I know what I'm doing." Charles felt his blood boil. The audacity of this man was infuriating. "You're not welcome here," he said through gritted teeth. "Now leave." The officer took a step back, then looked at Charles with a sinister smile. You've got a big mouth for an old man. Maybe I should teach you some respect." Before Charles could react, the officer's hand shot out and shoved him hard in the chest. Charles stumbled but managed to keep his footing. The younger officer stepped forward, trying to calm the situation, but his partner was beyond reason. "Charles!" Evelyn's voice cried out from the porch, fear laced in every syllable. The young men on the curb watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to intervene or stay put. The entire block seemed to hold its breath as the confrontation escalated. Charles stood tall, his eyes burning with defiance. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't come back from war to be treated like this." The blonde officer laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "War, huh? Maybe you should have stayed there." And with that, he lunged at Charles. The two men collided with a force that shook the air around them. Charles, despite his age, fought back with everything he had. His training from years ago kicked in, but his body was no longer as strong as it once was. The officer's fists were relentless, landing blow after blow. Evelyn screamed, rushing from the porch toward her husband. The younger officer hesitated, clearly torn between helping Charles and obeying his partner. Neighbors began to gather, their faces filled with shock and horror. But no one dared step forward. No one knew what to do. As the beating continued, Charles fell to his knees, blood trickling down his face. His breaths were labored, but he refused to go down without a fight. "Stop!" Evelyn cried, her voice breaking as she reached for her husband. But the officer didn't stop. The scene had turned into a nightmare. Charles collapsed onto the pavement with a sickening thud, his breathing ragged and shallow. Blood trickled from the side of his mouth, staining the collar of his shirt. The blonde officer, towering over him, stepped back momentarily, wiping the sweat from his brow as if he had just finished some mundane chore. There was a terrifying calmness in his demeanor, as though the violence he had just inflicted was routine. Evelyn dropped to her knees beside her husband, her hands trembling as she cradled his bruised face. Her cries were low and frantic. "Charles, please. Please, wake up, baby. Stay with me." She wiped the blood from his lips, her fingers shaking as tears streamed down her cheeks. The younger officer stood frozen, clearly overwhelmed. His eyes darted between his partner and the elderly couple on the ground. His face was pale, his body tense. It was clear he was struggling with the situation unraveling in front of him. For a moment, he opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. His hands fidgeted near his holster, torn between protocol and conscience. Around them, the neighborhood seemed to vibrate with tension. People had gathered in small groups, their hushed whispers mixing with the distant sound of barking dogs. Mothers held their children close, and older men stood with furrowed brows, shaking their heads in disbelief. No one moved forward. The presence of police had a way of freezing people in place, even when every fiber of their being screamed to act. Charles let out a low groan, trying to lift himself from the ground. His vision blurred, but he could still make out the shape of Evelyn beside him. Her voice, though panicked, was the only thing grounding him in this moment of chaos. "You're gonna be okay, Charles. You hear me?" Evelyn's voice quivered with both fear and determination, but she held his hand tightly, refusing to let go. She glanced up at the blonde officer, her eyes filled with a fury that she had never felt before. "Why are you doing this? He's done nothing wrong." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. The blonde officer didn't even bother to look at her. He was inspecting his knuckles, flexing his fingers as if preparing for round 2. His lack of response made Evelyn's blood boil. This wasn't just cruelty, this was indifference. He didn't see them as people. They were just bodies to him, bodies he could control, bodies he could punish. Evelyn's anger surged, her protective instincts taking over. "You coward," she shouted, her voice breaking as she pointed at him. "You think you can just do this? You think no one will stand up to you?" She glared at the younger officer, who still stood motionless. "And you're just gonna stand there? Watch him do this." The younger officer's eyes flickered with shame, but he remained silent, his hands now clenched at his sides. The blonde officer glanced at his partner, his expression hardening. "You want to say something, rookie?" His voice was dangerously calm, a challenge lingering beneath the words. The younger officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He took a hesitant step forward, as if trying to gather the courage to speak. I think we should call for backup," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is getting out of hand." The blonde officer smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Backup? For this old man and his wife? Are you kidding me?" Evelyn rose to her feet, her fists clenched at her sides. She was not a physically imposing woman, but in that moment, her presence seemed to grow. She took a step toward the blonde officer, her face twisted with rage. "You don't scare me. You think because you wear that uniform, you can treat us however you want. Charles fought for this country, you hear me? He's a veteran, and he deserves better than this." For the first time, the blonde officer's expression faltered. A flicker of something, perhaps recognition, passed across his face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. His smirk returned, crueler this time. Veteran or not, he disrespected a police officer, and that's a crime. Evelyn was trembling now, but it wasn't fear coursing through her veins, it was fury. "Disrespect," she spat the word. "You're the one who should be ashamed. You call yourself a man of the law. You're nothing but a bully in a uniform." The tension in the air crackled, thick enough to cut with a knife. Evelyn's words seemed to hang between them, daring the officer to respond. But before he could, there was movement from the crowd. A young woman, no more than 25, stepped forward. Her eyes were locked on the blonde officer, but her voice was steady. "She's right, you know. You're wrong for this." Another voice piped up, this time from an elderly man who had been watching from his porch. "We all saw it. You can't do this." Slowly, more and more neighbors began stepping forward, inching closer to the scene. What had started as hushed whispers was growing into a murmur of discontent. The blonde officer's gaze darted between them, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The younger officer glanced around, visibly nervous now. "Maybe we should go," he suggested again, more firmly this time. But the blonde officer wasn't ready to back down. His jaw clenched, and he took a threatening step toward Evelyn. "You better get back, lady, before you regret it." Evelyn didn't flinch. "You've already done enough. You're not laying another hand on my husband." As the crowd continued to grow, the tension reached a boiling point. The officer's hand twitched toward his baton, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just two defenseless people against him. It was an entire community. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Charles stirred on the ground, his body aching with pain, but he could feel the shift too. Evelyn's grip tightened on his hand, and he squeezed back as best he could. The blonde officer's face contorted in frustration. His authority, which had seemed so absolute just moments ago, was crumbling before his eyes. The eyes of the crowd were on him, and their collective will was like a force pressing down on him. But then, sirens. In the distance, the sound of more police cars approaching. The wailing of sirens grew louder, sending an electric jolt through the crowd that had gathered around Charles and Evelyn. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was about to unfold. The sight of more police cars barreling toward the scene only added to the uncertainty. Some instinctively began stepping back, as if bracing themselves for the worst, while others remained rooted in place, defiant in their stance. Evelyn knelt beside Charles, her breath shaky but her resolve unbroken. "Charles, stay with me, please," she whispered, clutching his hand tightly. His eyes fluttered open briefly, and he winced from the pain that rippled through his battered body. His lips moved, but the words were too faint for her to hear. As the police cars screeched to a halt nearby, 3 more officers emerged from their vehicles. Their uniforms gleamed under the waning sunlight, and the air seemed to thicken with their arrival. 2 of them, older and more seasoned, assessed the scene with hawkish precision, while the third, a younger woman, glanced between the crowd and the officers already present. The blonde officer, still towering over Charles and Evelyn, straightened his posture as if expecting reinforcements to validate his actions. The sneer on his face widened, though his eyes flickered with a nervous edge. He glanced at the approaching officers and then at the crowd, which had now swelled to more than a dozen people. The tension hung like a fragile thread, threatening to snap at any moment. The first of the new arrivals, a grizzled officer with silver hair and a hard expression, spoke up, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "What's going on here?" The blonde officer stepped forward, eager to explain. "Just handling a situation, sir. These folks were getting out of line, and this 1 inch," he gestured toward Charles's crumpled form, decided to interfere. The older officer's eyes narrowed as he looked at Charles, then shifted to Evelyn, who was still hunched protectively over her husband. His gaze lingered for a moment longer, and something seemed to pass over his face, something that the blonde officer didn't notice. Before he could continue, a voice from the crowd called out. He didn't interfere. He was trying to stop him from beating those boys. It was the young woman who had spoken earlier. She took a step forward, her voice rising with courage. We all saw it. The silver-haired officer's eyes scanned the crowd, which began to murmur in agreement. More voices chimed in, telling the same story, how Charles had stood up for the young men, how the blonde officer had escalated the situation, how it had all spiraled out of control. The younger female officer looked visibly shaken by the crowd's testimony. She exchanged a worried glance with her partner, the silver-haired officer, but neither of them moved to stop the voices that were now recounting every brutal detail. The blonde officer, however, was growing more agitated by the second. His jaw clenched as he took a step forward, addressing the silver-haired officer directly. They're lying. They're just trying to make this into something it's not. But the silver-haired officer didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on Charles, who was now groaning softly as he tried to lift himself from the ground. Evelyn's hands trembled as she helped him sit up, her face filled with a mix of fear and determination. Finally, the older officer turned to the younger blonde officer. You hit this man. The blonde officer faltered, taken aback by the directness of the question. He got in my face. He was being aggressive. I had no choice. The silver-haired officer's expression hardened. An elderly man. A veteran. You had no choice. Before the blonde officer could answer, another voice from the crowd rang out. You attacked him first. He wasn't doing anything except trying to help. The crowd began to buzz with more accusations, and it became clear that the situation was spiraling beyond the blonde officer's control. The younger rookie, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice shaky but clear. It's true. He didn't deserve this. I tried to tell him to back off, but he wouldn't listen. The blonde officer's face turned crimson, his eyes widening with rage. You're siding with them, he barked, his voice dripping with disbelief. You're a cop, for God's sake. The rookie stood firm, though his body was visibly shaking. We're supposed to protect people. This wasn't right. The blonde officer's hand shot toward his belt, but before he could make another move, the silver-haired officer stepped between them, his tone authoritative. That's enough. For a brief moment, the street fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the distant echo of traffic on nearby roads. The crowd held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The blonde officer's chest heaved with anger, but he didn't dare defy the command of the senior officer standing before him. The two men locked eyes, and it was clear to everyone that a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be undone with a simple apology. "Take him back to the station," the silver-haired officer ordered, his voice low but firm. He nodded to the female officer, who moved forward cautiously, her hand resting on the blonde officer's arm as she guided him toward the patrol car. "Are you serious?" The blonde officer spat, yanking his arm away from her grip. "You're really going to believe them over me?" The silver-haired officer's expression didn't waver. "You'll have a chance to explain yourself, but right now, you're done here." The blonde officer let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Unbelievable. He shot one last venomous look at the crowd, at Charles and Evelyn, before turning on his heel and stomping back toward the cruiser. The female officer followed, casting a quick glance back at the scene. As the car door slammed shut, the tension in the air finally began to lift, but the damage had already been done. Charles, still leaning heavily on Evelyn, struggled to breathe, his chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. The silver-haired officer turned to Evelyn, his eyes softer now. "We're going to get him medical attention right away," he assured her. "He needs to be checked out." Evelyn nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The officer waved down the paramedics, who had arrived moments earlier and had been waiting to approach. They rushed toward Charles with a stretcher, carefully lifting his fragile body from the ground. Evelyn clung to his hand the entire time, refusing to let go as they loaded him into the ambulance. The crowd remained, some still murmuring, others simply watching in silence. But no one moved to leave. As the ambulance's doors closed with a metallic click and the sirens roared back to life, Evelyn took one last look at the house where she and Charles had built a life together, a life now shattered by the violence of one man. The ambulance pulled away, disappearing down the road. But the memory of what had just happened lingered like a dark cloud over the entire street. The ambulance sped down the road, lights flashing, cutting through the late afternoon gloom. Inside, Evelyn sat next to Charles, clutching his hand as tightly as she could. The paramedics worked around her, checking his vitals, applying bandages to his bruised face, and administering oxygen to help with his labored breathing. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor provided a steady background noise, but it did little to calm Evelyn's nerves. Charles's eyes flickered open every now and then, his lips parting to try and speak, but the pain was too much. Evelyn stroked his hand gently, whispering reassurances, though she could barely keep her own tears at bay. "You're going to be okay, Charles. We'll get through this," she said, her voice trembling. "Just stay with me." The paramedic across from her glanced up briefly, his expression professional but sympathetic. "We'll be at the hospital in a few minutes, ma'am. He's stable for now, but the doctors will need to assess him for any internal injuries." Evelyn nodded, though her mind was racing. How had things gone so wrong, so fast? 1 minute, she and Charles had been sitting on their porch, enjoying a quiet afternoon. The next, they were here, her husband bloodied and broken, and their world turned upside down. The hatred and violence of that officer had come out of nowhere, and now Charles was paying the price. She squeezed his hand harder. "Charles, I need you to stay strong for me. You fought worse battles than this, haven't you? You can't let this take you down." Charles groaned softly, his eyes fluttering again. He squeezed her hand back, the gesture faint but enough to let her know he was still fighting. It gave her a flicker of hope in the midst of all the uncertainty. He had always been a fighter, ever since they met. Whether it was in war or life's daily struggles, Charles never gave up. And he wasn't going to give up now. The ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance of the hospital, and the paramedics quickly wheeled Charles out on a gurney, rushing him into the trauma unit. Evelyn followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital contrasted sharply with the chaos of the street, but they offered no comfort. A team of doctors and nurses swooped in, their hands working expertly as they examined Charles and moved him to an operating room. One of the doctors, a middle-aged man with sharp features and kind eyes, approached Evelyn. "Mrs. Richardson, we're going to take your husband into surgery to address some potential internal injuries. He's stable, but we need to stop the bleeding and make sure there's no further damage." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Surgery? Is it serious?" The doctor's expression was calm, but his tone was direct. "We need to operate to prevent further complications, but I assure you we're going to do everything we can for him. He's in good hands." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight as she tried to hold back her tears. "Please, please save him." The doctor gave a brief nod before hurrying back to his team, and they wheeled Charles through the double doors, disappearing into the sterile depths of the hospital. Evelyn stood there, alone in the hallway, the cold fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow around her. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt utterly powerless. She collapsed into one of the waiting room chairs, burying her face in her hands as the weight of everything came crashing down on her. The fear, the anger, the helplessness, it was all too much. Her husband, the man who had stood by her side for more than 50 years, the man who had fought for his country and survived the horrors of war, was now lying on an operating table because of the cruelty of a man in a uniform. She lifted her head and looked around the waiting room. A few people sat scattered in various corners, lost in their own thoughts. No one seemed to notice her, but she could feel the weight of their collective anxiety. Hospitals were places of waiting, of uncertainty, and of hope hanging by a thread. Evelyn knew this feeling all too well. She had waited for Charles to come home from war, and she had waited for him through health scares in the past, but this time felt different. This time, she wasn't sure if she could keep her fear at bay. Hours passed. Evelyn sat in that cold waiting room, her mind racing with 1,000 what-ifs. Each minute felt like an eternity, the sound of doctors' footsteps and the occasional beeping of machines the only things to break the silence. She replayed the events of the afternoon over and over in her mind, the image of that blonde officer's twisted face etched into her memory. How could a man like that wear a badge? How could someone entrusted with the protection of the public be capable of such hatred? The door to the waiting room opened, and a familiar face walked in. It was Rebecca Jones, a neighbor who had witnessed the entire incident. She had been one of the first to step forward and speak up when things had spiraled out of control. Rebecca rushed over to Evelyn, her face full of concern. "Evelyn, I came as soon as I heard. How's Charles? Is he okay?" Rebecca asked, sitting down next to her and taking her hand. Evelyn shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's in surgery. They're trying to stop the bleeding. They said they need to check for internal damage." Rebecca's face paled, and she squeezed Evelyn's hand tighter. "This is all so horrible. I can't believe that cop. He was out of control. We all saw it." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with tears she had been fighting to hold back. "I don't understand. Why did this happen? Why Charles? He's never hurt anyone. He was just trying to stop that officer from harassing those boys." Rebecca looked down, her jaw clenched in frustration. "Because people like that officer don't see us as people, Evelyn. They see us as threats. It doesn't matter if you're a war hero or an innocent kid. If you're black, you're guilty in their eyes." The truth of Rebecca's words hit Evelyn like a punch to the gut. She had known this reality her whole life, but it never got any easier to accept. She had hoped, in her later years, that the world had changed, that things had gotten better. But today had shattered that illusion. A long silence stretched between them before Rebecca spoke again. "I'm going to talk to a lawyer. We need to hold that officer accountable. We can't let him get away with this." Evelyn nodded, but her thoughts were still with Charles, lying in that operating room. Holding someone accountable felt like a distant goal when her husband's life was hanging in the balance. "Thank you, Rebecca," Evelyn whispered, her voice fragile. "I just want Charles to come out of this." Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity. Evelyn sat in the sterile waiting room, her mind a storm of fear and worry. Rebecca stayed by her side, silent but offering the warmth of companionship. Every so often, Evelyn's eyes darted toward the double doors at the end of the hallway, hoping a doctor would appear with news, any news. The sound of the hospital machinery and faint conversations in the distance only heightened her anxiety, each tick of the clock echoing louder in her head. Finally, the door swung open, and the same doctor from earlier emerged, his surgical mask pulled down and his expression grave but composed. He approached Evelyn, who stood up quickly, her heart in her throat. "Mrs. Richardson," he began, his tone gentle, "your husband's surgery went as well as could be expected. We were able to stop the internal bleeding, and his vital signs are stable. But he's been through a lot. The physical trauma, combined with his age, means the next 24 hours are critical. We're going to keep him under observation in the ICU." Evelyn's knees buckled, and Rebecca quickly supported her. "Can I see him?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded. "Yes, but only for a short time. He's heavily sedated, and we need to keep a close eye on him." Evelyn nodded, and the doctor led her through the double doors. As they walked down the long corridor, Evelyn's heart raced, filled with both relief and dread. Charles had survived the surgery, but the battle was far from over. She had to be strong, for him, for herself, for everything they had built together. They arrived at the ICU, and the doctor opened the door to Charles's room. The sight of him nearly broke her. Charles lay motionless, hooked up to machines that beeped steadily, his face pale and swollen from the beating he had endured. His chest rose and fell with the assistance of a ventilator, and bandages covered his side where the surgery had taken place. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his. "Charles," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm here. I'm right here." He didn't stir, but his hand, limp under hers, felt warm. She squeezed it gently, praying he could feel her presence, praying that somewhere deep inside, he knew she was there fighting for him. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she wiped them away quickly, refusing to let herself crumble. Charles had always been the fighter, but now it was her turn. The doctor gave her a few moments alone before stepping back into the room. "He'll need a lot of rest and time to heal. The next day is critical, but if he makes it through, there's a good chance he'll pull through. He's a strong man." Evelyn nodded, her voice too thick with emotion to respond. She stayed by his side for as long as the doctors allowed before they gently urged her to go back to the waiting room. "We'll keep you updated," the nurse said softly, as Evelyn gave one last glance at Charles before stepping out of the room. When she returned to the waiting area, Rebecca stood up immediately, searching her face for some sign of news. "He's stable," Evelyn said quietly, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "But it's still touch and go." Rebecca let out a sigh of relief, her hand over her heart. "That's good news. He's tough, Evelyn. He's going to make it." Evelyn wanted to believe that. She had to believe that. But the image of Charles, lying so still and vulnerable, haunted her. The man who had once been so full of life, who had always stood tall and proud, now lay broken, his fate uncertain. All because of the violence of one man. As she sat down, her mind drifted back to that moment, the moment everything changed. She remembered the look on the blonde officer's face, the twisted smirk as he towered over Charles, the brutal force of his fists as he struck an old man with no regard for his life. The officer's sneering indifference still burned in her memory. Rebecca broke the silence. "We need to get that cop off the streets, Evelyn. He can't be allowed to do this to anyone else. I've already contacted a lawyer. We're going to hold him accountable." Evelyn nodded, but her thoughts were still tangled with the day's events. It's not just about that one officer, Rebecca. It's bigger than him. It's the whole system, the way they treat us, the way they look at us like we're nothing. Charles didn't deserve this. No one does. Rebecca's eyes softened, and she reached for Evelyn's hand. I know. But we have to start somewhere. We can't let him get away with it. Just then, the door to the waiting room swung open again. Evelyn tensed, expecting more news about Charles, but instead, two men in suits walked in. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding the room, while the other was shorter, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. They carried an air of authority that immediately set Evelyn on edge. The taller man approached, pulling out a badge and introducing himself. Mrs. Richardson. I'm Detective Jameson. This is my partner, Detective Ruiz. We're here to talk about the incident involving your husband earlier today. Evelyn blinked, surprised by their sudden appearance. How did you? We've been assigned to investigate the situation, Jameson said, his tone professional. We understand there was an altercation between your husband and a police officer. We've already spoken to several witnesses at the scene. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or anxious. The fact that detectives were already involved could mean things were moving in the right direction, but it also meant she'd have to relive the nightmare all over again. I'm not sure how much help I can be, Evelyn said, her voice shaking. But that officer, he attacked my husband for no reason. Charles didn't do anything wrong. We've heard similar accounts from others, Detective Ruiz chimed in, his voice softer than his partner's. We want to assure you that we're taking this very seriously. Good, Rebecca interjected, her tone sharp. Because we're not going to let this slide. That cop needs to be held accountable for what he did. Jameson nodded. We're here to gather all the facts. Rest assured, there will be a full investigation, and the officer in question has already been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope at the news, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of everything else. What about Charles? She asked. What happens to us while this investigation goes on? He's lying in a hospital bed because of that officer. How do we move forward? Jameson's expression softened, and he knelt down slightly to meet Evelyn's eyes. Mrs. Richardson, we understand this is a difficult time for you and your family. We're going to do everything in our power to make sure justice is served. But I need you to trust the process. We'll be in touch regularly, and we'll keep you informed every step of the way. Evelyn nodded, though a part of her remained skeptical. Trusting the system wasn't easy, not after everything that had happened. But what choice did she have? Charles was fighting for his life, and now, she had to fight for justice. As the detectives left, Rebecca turned to her. We'll get through this, Evelyn. Charles will get through this. And that officer, he won't get away with what he did. Not this time. Evelyn hoped Rebecca was right. For now, all she could do was wait, pray, and hope for a miracle. The hours that followed felt like a blur. Evelyn stayed seated in the waiting room, her body heavy with exhaustion but her mind racing. Rebecca had eventually left, promising to come back in the morning, but Evelyn couldn't bring herself to leave Charles's side for long. She made trips back to the ICU, standing at the window to his room, watching the machines as they quietly monitored his fragile body. Her heart sank every time she saw him, motionless except for the rise and fall of his chest, aided by the ventilator. She sat back down in the waiting room and closed her eyes, but all she could see was that cop's face. His cold, indifferent expression as he swung his baton, not once, but again and again. The crack of it against Charles's ribs haunted her. He had taken pleasure in it, there was no doubt in her mind. That officer hadn't just been enforcing the law. He had been out for blood, and it had been her husband's blood he wanted. Footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She opened her eyes to see a nurse walking toward her, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Richardson," the nurse said gently. "Your husband is stable, and he's being transferred to a private room. You can go in and sit with him now." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "He's awake?" The nurse gave a sympathetic smile. "Not yet, but the doctors are optimistic. He's still in critical condition, but the fact that he made it through the night is a good sign." Evelyn stood up, her legs shaky from the long hours of sitting. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. She followed the nurse down the hall, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the bright lights adding to the surreal feeling that had settled over her since the attack. When they reached Charles's new room, it was quieter, more peaceful than the chaotic environment of the ICU. Evelyn stepped inside, her eyes drawn immediately to her husband. He looked so fragile, lying there amidst the tangle of tubes and wires. She pulled up a chair next to his bed and gently took his hand. It was still warm, still strong, despite everything. She squeezed it, hoping that somehow, in his unconscious state, he could feel her. "Charles, I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going anywhere." She sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, watching his chest rise and fall. Time seemed to lose all meaning as she held his hand, praying silently that he would wake up, that he would come back to her. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness. Evelyn looked up to see Detective Jameson standing in the doorway, his expression somber. He stepped inside, his large frame seeming out of place in the quiet hospital room. "Mrs. Richardson," he said quietly, "I wanted to give you an update on the investigation." Evelyn blinked, her mind struggling to shift from her thoughts of Charles to the reality of the situation. "Has anything happened?" she asked, her voice weary. Jameson nodded. "We've gathered statements from several witnesses, including your neighbor, Mrs. Jones. It's clear that the officer used excessive force. Based on the evidence and the statements we've collected, we're recommending charges against him." Evelyn's heart fluttered with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Charges?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "So, he'll be held accountable?" Jameson sighed, his expression conflicted. "It's not that simple. The officer has been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, but there's still a long process ahead. The district attorney will have to decide whether to press formal charges, and even then, there will be legal battles to face. But I promise you, we're doing everything we can to make sure justice is served." Evelyn gripped Charles's hand tighter, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "It shouldn't be this hard. My husband is lying here because of that man. How can it take so long to hold him accountable?" Jameson nodded, his eyes softening. "I know it's frustrating, Mrs. Richardson. I wish I could give you more immediate answers. But the legal system moves slowly, and these cases are complicated. We need to build a rock-solid case if we're going to win." Evelyn shook her head, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. "I just want him to wake up. I want him to be okay." Jameson hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "I've seen a lot of cases like this, Mrs. Richardson. Some end in tragedy, but others pull through. Your husband, he's a fighter. Don't lose hope." Evelyn nodded, her throat too tight to respond. Jameson gave her a brief nod before turning to leave, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway as he disappeared through the door. For a long time, Evelyn just sat there, holding Charles's hand and listening to the steady hum of the machines. The idea of justice felt distant, almost irrelevant. All that mattered now was her husband's recovery. Everything else could wait. But just as she began to feel herself slipping back into the haze of exhaustion, she felt something, a slight movement in Charles's hand. Her heart leapt. She leaned forward, staring at his face, searching for any sign that he was waking up. "Charles," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Charles, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, his fingers twitching ever so slightly beneath hers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Tears welled up in her eyes as she leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Charles, I'm here. You're in the hospital, but you're going to be okay. Just stay with me." His eyes slowly opened, squinting against the harsh hospital lights. He looked disoriented, confused, but he was awake. He was alive. "Evelyn." His voice was raspy, barely more than a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "I'm here, Charles," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here." He blinked, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece together what had happened. What happened?" Evelyn gently stroked his hand, her voice soothing. "You were hurt, Charles. That officer, he attacked you. But you're safe now. You're in the hospital, and the doctors are taking care of you." Charles's face twisted in pain as he shifted slightly in the bed, the weight of his injuries clearly overwhelming him. "I remember," he wouldn't stop, he muttered, his voice thick with pain and confusion. Evelyn's heart broke at the sound of his voice, the weight of the trauma he had endured hanging between them like a heavy cloud. She wanted to tell him it was over, that the nightmare had passed, but she knew that wasn't true. The road ahead was still long, both for his physical recovery and for the justice they sought. "Just rest now," she whispered, wiping the tears from her eyes. "You don't have to worry about anything right now. We'll get through this together." Charles closed his eyes again, too exhausted to respond, but the faint squeeze of his hand in hers was all she needed. He was still there, still fighting, and as long as he was, so would she. The hours passed slowly, but there was a new sense of hope in the room. Charles was awake, and though his road to recovery would be long and difficult, he was alive. And as long as he was alive, Evelyn knew she had the strength to keep going. There would be time later to think about justice, to fight the battles that still lay ahead. For now, all that mattered was that Charles was still with her. Evelyn sat by Charles's side, her eyes never leaving him as the sun began to rise, casting a pale light into the hospital room. The last 24 hours had been a whirlwind of emotion, relief that Charles had survived the surgery, fear for what lay ahead, and a deep, simmering anger that refused to fade. The officer who had done this to her husband was still out there, and though he'd been suspended, it wasn't enough. Evelyn wanted justice, needed it, not just for Charles, but for all the others who had been brutalized and forgotten by a system that protected men like that cop. Charles stirred beside her, his eyes flickering open. His face was still swollen, the bruises dark and angry against his skin, but his gaze was sharper now, more focused. He was waking up, not just from the sedation, but from the fog of trauma that had clouded his mind. Evelyn leaned closer, her heart lifting as she saw the recognition in his eyes. "Evelyn," he rasped, his voice weak but steady. What happened?" "I remember bits and pieces, but everything's blurry." She took a deep breath, preparing herself for the conversation she knew they needed to have. "You were attacked, Charles. By a police officer. We were leaving the store, and he stopped us. He said you matched a description of a suspect. You tried to tell him you were a veteran, that you hadn't done anything wrong, but," her voice caught in her throat, the memory still raw and painful. Charles frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece it all together. He wouldn't listen. I remember him hitting me, over and over." His hand tightened around hers, the frustration and helplessness evident in his grip. "I didn't even fight back. I couldn't. He didn't care." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes as she squeezed his hand. "I know, Charles. He just kept hitting you. I tried to stop him, I tried to tell him to stop, but he wouldn't listen to me either." Charles closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling in labored breaths as the weight of the situation settled over him. "That cop, he didn't see me as a person. Just a target." Evelyn nodded, wiping away the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. "But we're going to make sure he's held accountable, Charles. Detectives are investigating, and they're recommending charges. They've talked to witnesses, and there's a lawyer who's going to help us. We're not going to let this go." Charles's eyes opened again, and though they were filled with pain, there was also a spark of determination. "I'm not going to let him get away with it," he muttered, his voice low but fierce. "I didn't survive 2 tours overseas to come home and be beaten like that. Not in front of my wife." Evelyn nodded, feeling the same fire building in her chest. She had never seen Charles so determined, so ready to fight. Despite everything, despite the injuries and the trauma, there was a strength in him that had not been broken. And that gave her hope. The door to the room opened, and the nurse stepped inside, smiling warmly at Charles. "Good morning, Mr. Richardson," she said. "How are you feeling?" Charles managed a weak smile. "Like I've been hit by a truck. But I'm still here." The nurse chuckled softly. "That's good to hear. You're doing better than most would after what you've been through. The doctor will be in soon to check on you, but for now, just rest. You've earned it." As the nurse left, Evelyn turned back to Charles, brushing a hand across his forehead. "You should rest. The doctor said the next few days are important for your recovery." Charles shook his head, grimacing as the movement caused pain to ripple through his body. "I can't just sit here, Evelyn. I need to know what's happening. I need to know that Cop is being dealt with." Evelyn hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. She didn't want to overwhelm him while he was still so fragile, but she also knew Charles wouldn't rest until he had answers. "They've suspended him, Charles. The detective said they're recommending charges, but it's going to take time. You know how these things go." Charles let out a long breath, his jaw clenched. "Time," he muttered. "That's what they always say." Meanwhile, he's sitting at home, probably thinking he's untouchable. "I've seen it before. Guys like him, they don't think the rules apply to them." Evelyn bit her lip, knowing he was right. She had heard too many stories, seen too many cases where justice was delayed, or denied altogether. But she couldn't let herself think that way, not now. "This time it's going to be different," she said, her voice firm. "We have witnesses, Charles. People saw what he did. And Rebecca's helping us with the legal side. We're going to make sure he doesn't get away with this." Charles nodded, but there was a weariness in his eyes, a deep-seated doubt that years of living as a black man in America had instilled in him. He had seen too much, experienced too much, to believe in justice easily. But he didn't argue. He was too tired, too battered to fight any more than he already had. The days that followed were slow, marked by small victories and long stretches of waiting. Charles's condition gradually improved, the bruises fading, the swelling going down, but the emotional wounds were slower to heal. Every time the door opened, every time the nurses came to check on him, Evelyn could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, the lingering trauma of the attack. Detective Jameson visited them regularly, keeping them updated on the investigation. The officer, whose name they had learned was Officer Darren Klein, was still under suspension, but no charges had been officially filed yet. The process was dragging on, and Evelyn could feel the frustration building inside her, gnawing at her patience. But she had to stay strong, for Charles's sake. She couldn't let herself crumble under the weight of it all. Then, one afternoon, nearly a week after the attack, Jameson returned with news. He stood at the foot of Charles's hospital bed, his expression grim but resolute. "The district attorney has decided to press charges," he said, his voice steady. "Officer Klein is being charged with assault and battery, as well as abuse of authority. He's been taken into custody." Evelyn's heart leapt at the news, a surge of relief washing over her. Charles, too, seemed to sit up a little straighter, though his expression remained serious. "What does that mean for us?" Charles asked, his voice low. It means there's going to be a trial, Jameson explained. It's not over yet, but this is a big step. The evidence is strong, and with the witnesses we have, there's a good chance he'll be convicted. But you both need to be prepared. It's going to be a long, difficult process. Evelyn nodded, her jaw set. We're ready, she said. We'll see this through. Jameson gave them a nod, his respect for their resilience evident in his eyes. I'll be with you every step of the way. We're going to make sure justice is served. As the detective left, Charles reached for Evelyn's hand, his grip stronger than it had been in days. We're not done fighting, he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. But we're going to win. Evelyn squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with pride. Yes, we are. They had been through hell, but they weren't broken. Together, they would fight, and together, they would see justice done.